Now, here's something that even experienced gardeners get confused. There are some big differences in gardening practices between planting a garden bed or a landscape and planting a vegetable garden. And at first, I know it sounds obvious that these two types of gardening, that they're very different, but most people can't guess off the top of their heads which gardening practices get confused between these two types, and that's where this gets really interesting. And oddly, it's pretty common for people to learn about gardening for the first time by vegetable gardening. If you search for how to garden, the first resources, the first YouTube videos that come up are mostly about vegetable gardening. And vegetable gardening is very fun, tomato, squash, beans. So it's almost as if the default information for first-time gardeners is the highest maintenance, perhaps the highest maintenance type of gardening. So maybe this is why we're assuming that gardening just inevitably takes a tremendous amount of time and energy and money. Maybe this is also why some experienced gardeners are still treating their garden beds and landscapes like they do their annual vegetable gardens. There's some other forces at play here, but there is an interesting distinction between these two types. So let's dive a bit deeper. Tomatoes, for example, are a high maintenance plant, but we love them anyway. Many of the common annual vegetables that are popular, in our vegetable garden raised beds, come from very different corners of the world. We choose these plants because we want to eat what they produce. We want to eat tomatoes. We do not choose these plants because they're low maintenance. When we grow something like these common vegetables, some fruits, some cut flowers, we are essentially trying to maximize production. These things are essentially crops. This is why you trellis. This is why you pinch and you prune and you train. This is why you buy all these fancy gadgets, because you want to make as many tomatoes as possible. And again, they're from different corners of the world where the soil might be completely different, which is why we're making adjustments. We're adding amendments to the soil. We want to keep the plant happy to produce as much food as possible. We're watering consistently to produce as much of this food as possible. Many vegetable garden plants need to be replanted year after year because they're annuals, so they just grow for one growing season. They complete their life cycle in one growing season. And sometimes they aren't true annuals, sometimes they're perennials, but they die when it gets too cold. So at the end of the growing season, they still need to be replanted year after year. Sometimes you might need to plant these crops multiple times per year because you're essentially harvesting the whole plant. Vegetable gardens can be really high maintenance. Now let's compare this to a low-maintenance garden bed or landscape. And we'll talk about a high-maintenance garden bed in a few moments and compare kind of where the wires are getting crossed. But for a low-maintenance garden bed, as opposed to an annual vegetable garden, the goal is to select plants that are happy to grow with the weather conditions you have and the soil you have. So you don't need to be making these adjustments. You don't need to be replanting things year after year. They need healthy soil, but they don't need fertilizer. You might need to make some adjustments to the soil one time before you plant, but then it's done. And if you select the right plants, you will need little or ideally no irrigation once the plants are established. That means you don't need a fancy irrigation system. Side note, all plants will need to be watered until they get established. Even the lowest maintenance, most drought-tolerant native plants, they will need watered for the first couple of growing seasons through any hot, dry periods until they can grow deep root systems. But this is temporary, so you can set up a temporary irrigation system and then get rid of it after the first couple of years. Generally a good idea to keep a garden hose on hand, of course, just so you can water things during any, extreme weather events. But that's a topic for another video. The idea is there's no fancy irrigation system needed. And you don't even need to prune plants if you select plants that are happy to grow to the correct size for the space that you have. Many gardeners assume that plants, they need to be pruned to be healthy. And you might make a few pruning cuts just for a few adjustments or to achieve a certain look or certain purpose, but many plants do not need to be pruned at all to be healthy and beautiful. And then people often say, well, the pretty plants are high maintenance, and that's why we grow these plants. That's why they're the most common. This is also not true. There are so many beautiful plants that are low maintenance. I guarantee wherever you live, there are many options for things that are beautiful that can even hold up to conventional, snooty, very perfect landscaping standards. Things that produce tons of beautiful blooms. Edible parts, fruits, berries, perennial vegetables, for example, are really fascinating. I'll link to a few books in the description below about perennial vegetables, plants that are just low maintenance. Again, you're selecting the right plant for the right place, but they can be low maintenance and produce tons of edible parts. There's trees with edible leaves. Did you know that? These things, you just get them established and then you can eat from them. There are tons of options out there. There are also some reasons why we eat the things we eat, why certain crops are normal as opposed to others. And it's really cool. You can dive deep into research each common plant and learn a little bit more about why we like this plant. It's not necessarily always because it's just the best, objectively the best tasting thing out there. There's no reason why our only option is to stick with these higher maintenance plants. It's just a different approach. It's just the way things have been done. And there are some interesting forces at play as far as why the plants that are the most popular are the most popular. Overall, the idea is to select plants that are happy to grow in the soil you have, the conditions you have. It's right plant, right place. I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times. The opposite is trying to change the space to match the needs of the plant. This is fertilizer. This is soil amendments, making adjustments, changing your watering or your irrigation patterns. We do this a lot. It sounds right plant, right place. It sounds so obvious. Yet so often we're doing the opposite. This is the type of low maintenance gardening that I personally like to focus on. This is how you create a beautiful oasis without it taking a tremendous amount of time and energy and money. Now, just for fun, I want to talk about the opposite and some of those interesting forces at play. What is the high maintenance gardening? What are the things that we're doing where these wires are getting crossed, where we are applying these higher maintenance practices? To start, something that's interesting is that we are often sold higher maintenance plants. Not always, but often, and this is intentional. And then we are sold the products that are needed to keep them alive and thriving, which is interesting. So it's not just on us. There's a reason why certain plants are popular too. The ones that are right inside the door, the ones you trip over at the garden center that they put right in that front display, generally tend to be a little bit more maintenance than others. Our first example, many of the annual flowers that are sold at garden centers. These are beautiful. They bloom a lot in just one growing season, right? That's common for annual plants. They tend to bloom a lot in one growing season. These plants have been hybridized to have lots of incredible, interesting colors and textures and to produce these, big blooms, a lot of big blooms in one growing season. They're often very sentimental for us because we've had family members who've been growing them for years. But what's interesting about annuals is they complete their life cycle in 1 year. So then next year, if you want to have them again, some of them you can save seeds from, some of them you can't. You have to buy them again. There's a reason why. These are the things that are really common in garden centers. These are the things that are promoted to us most often. But it's not just the annual plants, also perennials, trees and shrubs that we are sold that are not happy in our local soils, our local weather patterns. They might be susceptible to pests and diseases. And then we are sold the products that are necessary to keep these plants alive and thriving and looking good. It's interesting. Not all the time, of course, but this is still something that is definitely happening. And besides the things that were being sold, we still do tend to overcare for things. Many, dare I say most, trees, shrubs, and many perennials, they do not necessarily need to be fertilized. They don't need you to add an inch of compost around the base of the plant every year. They just don't need this. Yet we tend to do this because, again, this is that crossover of these high maintenance activities that come from annual vegetable garden plants that we're then applying to the rest of our landscape because we just don't know any better. Sometimes we install these permanent irrigation systems and we're watering plants that just don't even need it. They might be perfectly content to grow without irrigation, and we just don't know. And again, the common response is that, I want to grow pretty things. I live in this area and there's just too few low maintenance options that are beautiful in my area. I'm certain that there are more beautiful options in your area than you are aware of. I'm always learning about new plants myself. And if you start to reach out to people who have experience or who are intentionally researching plants that are very low maintenance for your area, I guarantee that there are beautiful things that you're not aware of yet. Keep learning. And even the most bland garden centers do tend to sell at least some interesting low maintenance and appropriate plants for your area. They're just not the ones that you're going to trip over right inside the door. And the first step is to do a little bit of research. If you would like help doing some research, I have a free mini course. It's called How to Choose the Perfect Plant. And it's got a checklist, so you can kind of go down the list and research all of the things that you should be considering to make sure that a plant is a good fit for your space. To access this, you do need to create an account, so username, password, so you can keep track of your progress as you move through the course. But that's linked in the description below. Be sure to check that out. If you are starting a new garden project and you'd like to learn more low maintenance best practices for creating a garden bed or a landscape, I just created this brand new course. It's called Green Thumb in an Hour. At the time of posting this video, it's at $30, and it is this beautiful and efficient introduction to all of the things I wish I knew when I first started, the practices that I learned about later when I was, why aren't more people talking about this? When I pick up a gardening book, why isn't this the first thing that people are telling me about? I focused on a lot of those topics in that course. Things like what we're talking about today, where are we applying higher maintenance gardening practices to plants that might not even need it? And then how do we focus on the plants that don't need all of this extra work? It's the 1 hour running start to prevent a common mistake, saving money, all while creating a beautiful and low maintenance oasis. Now, of course, I love annual vegetable gardening. I love growing cut flowers, and I choose some really high maintenance plants because this is something that I enjoy doing. If that's something that you like doing, then great. But it's not a requirement for your garden to be a ton of work to be beautiful. Or for even for it to produce a lot of flowers, food. It's just all about the approach. I'm sure you can see now why some of these wires get crossed, why some gardening best practices for one type of gardening are applied to another. We assume that we always need fertilizer and irrigation, but this is just not the case. And if you're new here, hello and welcome to Garden Project Academy. My name's Eve. I'm passionate about helping do-it-yourselfers who are starting new projects to design their own landscape, to have more successful garden projects, big and small, and to make the world a better place with the opportunity that you have to do some landscaping. I would love to hear about the projects that you're starting if you're willing to share in the comments below. And if you'd like to learn more about the steps to creating a landscape design plan, I'll make sure that video pops up right now, and it'll also be linked in the description below. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.